Hello and welcome to the Farm Forum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. We've recently passed the midpoint of 2024, so it's a good time to check in on trends. And today we're going to be looking specifically at trends in the clinical trial space. In today's podcast, brought to you by Advanced Clinical, I'm joined by Jason Casarella, EVP Business Development and Marketing at Advanced Clinical, and Casarella and Redecker, Chief Strategy Officer at Advanced Clinical. And they're going to be talking to me about some of the findings in their recently released Clinical Trends Report. We're going to be talking about broad trends like AI and representation, as well as more specific threads like the rise of clinical trial site networks. And if the conversation sparks your interest, check out the show notes for a link to the report itself. Welcome to the show, Jason and Caroline.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonah.
So just to start off, maybe tell me a little bit about yourselves and about the report and the work that you do at Advanced Clinical.
Sure, I'll kick things off. So my name is Jason Casarella. I've been with Advanced Clinical for almost 10 years, have been in the CRO industry for 27 years. And when we were doing our planning for 2024, our leadership team is always looking to stay ahead of trends and really learning about and thinking about how can we continue to not only differentiate our company, but make sure we're staying current with all of the changes in the industry. And we said it would be a good time, maybe at mid-year, to really do a piece that is a bit broad and forward looking, and how can we apply the learnings that we have really been spending time studying and incorporating into the business. And that's really the genesis of the report.
And Caroline?
Great. Casarella and Redecker. I have been with Advanced Clinical for 13 years and in the industry for a little over 30, and mostly on the CRO side of the business. And I'm focused on new service offerings, our company growth, where the industry is headed. I spend a lot of my time networking in industry organizations and really have spent the past year or two focused on decentralized trials and some of the new things happening in our space. And so excited to be here. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about this report. We'll go through and talk about a few of the trends. We're probably not going to be able to hit everything, so I do encourage people to check it out. But let's start with the funding piece. You guys have reported something of a recovery in R&D funding and an increase in mergers and acquisitions. What do we see as driving this positive funding environment, and what does it mean for the clinical trials space?
Sure. So I attended the Bio conference in San Diego, and there was a lot of data shared during that conference. One of the several data points was that private drug companies in the United States raised about $3.8 billion in the first quarter, which would be on pace with last year. PitchBook also released a report showing that funding was up from last year, but the number of deals are less. So we've heard from many sources that investors are being a bit more conservative about where they're placing their money. The venture capital funds are also raising cash, but the preclinical companies are seeing less investments. And the companies that are going the IPO route tend to be a little bit later stage clinical stage companies. But Caroline, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good overview. I would just add that we really are seeing, while there is funding available, it's been a little delayed at times. Investors are really being more careful in selecting where and when they spend their money. And so, there are specific areas, one of which we talked about were site networks, but just how they're investing overall, we see it's there. It's just a much more intentional as they invest.
Interesting. So let's talk about site networks. I think that's maybe one of the most interesting trends in the report is this idea that clinical trial site networks are becoming more prominent. So in case folks aren't familiar, what are we talking about when we talk about site networks? What are they, and which stakeholder are they sort of connected to in the research ecosystem?
Yeah, we see many different types of site networks. There have been large site acquisitions, hub and spoke type locations where you have a central location and then in the same community there are offshoot type sites within that same community, as well as integrated physician type networks where a research team is brought into clinic practices to put a research infrastructure around them. And then academic centers that have now local branches or affiliations. And so we see a lot of different models. There's also maybe not so much a network, but this mobile site type activity where, you can bring your research center into different communities through, you know, large, RV type sites. And so we see many different types of site networks. Some are therapeutically focused and some are, more general across all therapeutic areas. So we see a lot of different types.
And maybe another way to ask this question is when we talk about a site network, what's the alternative? What's that in opposition to in terms of maybe what's traditionally been?
So the alternative is an independent site or an academic center. And so if you need to recruit 200 patients, maybe you would have had 20 sites independent on a study where you could go to a network for half or all of those patients in the future. And so that's the alternative.
And in the report, you talk about sort of how increasingly the industry is moving towards this network model. There are more networks. What are some of the drivers of that? I think you sort of mentioned there are technical drivers and more sort of market forces driving.
Yeah, I would say that one of the drivers that we've seen is that um, access to patients, especially in underrepresented communities, under one platform is a major driver of this. And we've been actually tracking some of the transactions in this area. We've seen interest in site networks from private equity, private investors, institutions, as well as other CROs that have acquired networks and to kind of wrap this into their service offering.
Yeah, and it's really challenging for the independent site today because now with decentralized trial components, the need for diversity, for patient representation, those type of things, and the system requirements and all the different systems that they need to work in, it's challenging for the independent site. And they either need to become part of a network that provides them with infrastructure to compete or survive, or they need to do it themselves, which is a large investment. And already it's challenging for sites just to find and maintain their talent, and now they need this sort of new infrastructure. And so site networks are a new option to provide that platform.
And you kind of mentioned this earlier, but how does that kind of connect with the trend of decentralized trials? Does that make it sort of easier to become a part of this or to compete with these networks, or how does it kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, the decentralized trials really around technology and direct to patient shipments, and even really just doing research in a different way where everything doesn't coordinate through the site requires a lot more technology expertise and infrastructure. And so if a site doesn't want to develop that themselves, these site networks have the platform to help them survive in that type of environment. And of course,
When you're more
the promise is that it will become easier to identify and access patients, because if you have a network under EMR systems together, you know, to be able to identify those patients that represent the population with the disease will become much easier than independently site by site.
So ultimately, this could be a positive thing from the perspective of sponsors and research organizers. And what does this trend sort of mean for them? If you're reading this report and seeing this change, how do you interpret it as in terms of what does it mean for me as a pharma company, as a academic center that's running trials?
It's really about the patients, identifying, accessing the patients, and being able to get that representative population in one platform, or through a couple of site networks, versus having to manage all the independent sites together.
Do you want to add anything, Jason?
No, I think just to add on, the benefit to the sponsors is that it might cost more for sites to operate and provide this access. However, in the long run, it should help with the patient recruitment timeline, which really is the most costly process of drug development.
So recruitment is kind of what I wanted to talk about next. So that's a great segue. There's you say in the report that recruitment is a major recruitment is a major challenge for trials right now. What are some of the reasons behind this, and what can the industry be doing right now to address the challenge?
Sure. Well, it's patient recruitment. It's still the number one delay and adding cost to clinical trials. We see this across the studies that we manage today as we customize our approach to meet patient population. We also hear from sponsors often when we step into rescue studies. This is usually the most critical point of a trial, and it's often what we see is behind timeline the most, which is patient recruitment. Caroline, you wanted to add a few things?
Yeah, and it's only going to become more challenging as the diversity guidance, is still in draft, but now we're going to be targeting specific populations. So, if you needed 200 patients, in the earlier days, you didn't really need to worry about the makeup of those patients as long as they met the inclusion exclusion criteria. But now we're really trying to represent the population. So what was already challenging is becoming more challenging. And some of the good things that have happened around DCTs might attract some of those patient populations, but you still need to find them. So everything that we've seen so far in the decentralized trial environment is once you have the patient, they can screen and you can engage them better and make it easier to participate, but you still need to find them and recruit them. And that is the challenge that is still yet to be solved for the industry. It's we've kind of made the process better all around it. This is the next piece we really need to figure out as an industry.
So part of the puzzle on recruitment is that it is really a lot of the onus right now is placed on the individual provider to identify a patient who's a candidate for a trial, to be aware of the trials. I mean, is that kind of is that the old paradigm, or what are some of the sort of ways to make recruitment more, more sort of a broad project, that it maybe is less kind of dependent on individuals?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because old school was I select the right sites, I get the patients. Then there were sort of all these recruitment type efforts that have come to light. But what we're finding is when we're looking for patients that represent the people who have the disease, you see now you might need to look at different investigators. And so it's sort of like yes, no, and yes again, right? It was pick the right sites, then it was let's feed the patients into the sites. And now it's a little bit of both and making sure you have the right sites that the represented population will want to go to.
So there's definitely a connection between, I mean, we've already talked about representation in this sort of part of the reason recruitment is becoming so challenging, you said, is because there is more of an expectation of recruiting a diverse representative sample. But I guess just to take a step back on that, how's the industry doing on that front? I mean, I know it's something that has been much more talked about in the last 2, 3, 4 years, and it feels like there's progress. But how do we kind of is there any metric by which we can say, oh yeah, trials are much more representative and diverse now, or we're getting there, but how does that kind of all look?
Yeah, so the diversity guidance from the FDA is still in draft form, and so and it's a guidance today that's in draft, but not a requirement. We do, however, see our customers moving in this direction as being more of a standard. We have diversity plans and targets for a majority of our studies. We've also had customers that have gone in for meetings at the agencies and been told that they want a specific percent of a population. And so we're seeing it more from the sponsors as a proactive approach, and we're seeing it from the agency coming both from having the guidance and then actually in the client meetings having discussions around the represented population. It's supposed to be out pretty much any day, this final diversity guidance. So we'll see where it goes from there. But today it's not a requirement, but we're really seeing it all moving towards that direction.
And I would add that patients also tend to want a physician that looks like them, which is putting some pressure to have a diverse group of principal investigators as part of that diversity plan. So again, we're seeing that more and more.
In the report, you kind of talk about the need for focused innovation, especially around AI and ML. Like, so there's been a lot of hype, but let's sort of zoom in. But talk to me about that term, focused innovation, and what do you mean by it? How is it different from maybe other kinds of innovation?
I think AI and ML are one component, but what we mean by focused innovation is we're really seeing sponsors changing the way they're approaching innovation. So it used to be, you know, looking for the latest thing that somebody created for that they could bring in house and implement, or use as a service provider. But what we're finding now is that they are really challenging themselves to look at what are the problems that they're trying to solve and what is the best innovative approach to address that problem. And sometimes it's AI or ML, and sometimes it's other changes to processes or the way things are being managed. And we see things even in DCTs, direct to patient shipment, and some of the things that are happening that have changed the way that research is being done to make it easier for the patient and incorporate the needs of the patient. And so we definitely see AI and ML. We've participated. We have some technology partners where we have helped them with their machine learning to make their technology better. And our team, does the work and allows that technology to follow that work. And so we participate with partners and sponsors and on our own side. But I'll turn it to Jason to answer kind of where he sees things.
Sure. And I see it, the same way, but we all know that the application and growth of artificial intelligence, machine learning is impacting so many businesses across so many different industries today. When you look at what McKinsey put out, they showed that AI investment really has more than doubled since 2017, 50 to 60% increase in investments in the recent couple of years. But specific to the clinical research industry, there's many companies, as Caroline mentioned, that are stepping in to apply AI and ML to streamline parts of the clinical development process. Seems to be a real interest in using AI to speed the drug discovery process to really help analyze massive data sets to really accelerate the identification of drug targets. In the clinical stage, we're seeing applications of using large language models to really accelerate study documents such as informed consents, regulatory documents, CRF. So there's time savings, and I think the use cases and test cases are still being developed and disseminated among the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that this is a very delicate area. Obviously, right now everyone is trying AI in every industry and kind of throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks. But obviously, when you're looking at working with patients and generating, clinical trial results that'll be robust, that'll be accepted by the FDA, that won't make you have to redo, uh, you know, super expensive trial. Um, it does mean you have to be innovative, but also careful, especially when you're talking about these large language models that can hallucinate, that can be biased. So, what are some of the how do you see that balance being struck in the industry? Are people, who are using AI and especially using these language models, are there particular kind of use cases where it's pretty accepted that the risk is low, or how do you balance that?
Well, I think the industry is naturally somewhat risk averse, highly regulated industry. To me, it feels a little bit like some of the pre-pandemic usage of DCT. There was some level of reluctance or resistance to usage, and then the pandemic occurred and it required rapid acceleration. And I think people saw that as it does work. It does bring efficiency into the clinical trial process. Now looking at other industries that have incorporated AI and ML, I think there's a more openness to piloting and the use of these tools and combining those with some of these DCT applications. For example, there's companies that are crowdsourcing patient data to really aggregate and analyze patient population data, but there's always going to be lingering questions around privacy and patient protection that is really central to the way that our industry operates.
Yeah, and I think it depends where you're talking about the use. So We see AI companies that go into put their platform over a drug company's all of their study data across their studies to find things that they weren't looking for, or maybe there's different ways of using it in the patient recruitment process before they're in a clinical trial. When we see a lot of AI being used even in patient-driven communities where patients are offering their information and then the AI crowdsources it. So I feel like there are many opportunities for the use of AI across the drug development process, not just for managing the clinical trial, that are valuable. And then even within the clinical trial, I was mentioning that we worked with a vendor partner for a technology that manages eTMF. And so we were just teaching the TMF technology how to do what we normally would do so that they could save some steps. And so it just shortens a process. And that technology is regulated and validated. So, it's not really a risk to the study. It's just a different way of working in a more efficient manner. So I think we see it, in the short term, there's some definite use cases. In the long term, there will be many more.
Well, this has been super interesting. We have some more time for sure. So, is there anything else we haven't talked about? Anything else in the report that you guys think is worth drilling in on a little bit, or just general trends? Anything you're curious about?
Yeah, I would say, one of the things that we're really seeing with our customers is the increased pressure they feel for sponsor oversight and maybe some of the experiences they've had over time that are making them consider different outsourcing or resourcing models. We're starting to see them take certain expertise in house or maybe do it through a dedicated team in an FSP model or something of that nature. And so, really, we're seeing sponsors think differently, even about how they're managing and outsourcing and resourcing their trials.
Yep, and I would just add and agree with all that. I think given economic conditions, because we mentioned at the start of the discussion today that even though there are some optimistic signs of increased funding and increased financial um, positive indications, it hasn't exactly flown through everything. So we're still seeing some delayed trial starts. We see layoffs across the entire industry, companies of all size. And I think that's really causing companies to look inward to say, how can we operate in the most efficient manner, most cost effective manner? And this usage of some sort of mixed or hybrid model really is becoming very attractive to many companies. They're looking at internal core competencies. They're looking at where they may not be strong, whether that's functionally or geographically or even therapeutically, and keeping an open mind to building a mixed delivery model with their external partners to ensure that their clinical research is delivered in the most cost effective manner. And I think that's going to continue.
We really see that pressure coming to our customers from their management teams. So we get asked that question a lot. What can I do? They're asking me to be more efficient in the way this is happening. Do you have any thoughts around that? And particularly when you look at something like clinical monitoring or some of the more expensive components of a clinical trial, if there is a way to make it more efficient across studies, it's really something that we see customers spending time on right now. And I don't think that's going to change, because even when funding, releases faster, now there's a mindset of being more efficient.
When you think about the different trends that we've talked about today in terms of representation, these clinical trial site networks, and AI and ML and decentralization, do you feel like these are trends that are pulling kind of together, or in some ways sort of like in tension with each other, right? Where people are trying to save money, but they also have this new responsibilities and requirements around representation. I mean, how do you kind of think folks are looking at this as holistically?
Yeah, I do think that it sort of all goes together. There might be areas where we have to spend more, but in the long run, it'll be more efficient and we'll save more, or we'll be able to reach what the requirements are for representation. And so there's the, what do we need to do, and there's the what we can do to become more efficient. And I think those are going to merge together in the future. And this also goes around EMR data and EMR to EDC, and maybe cutting some monitoring costs, and some, having sort of remote monitoring and data scientists, and some of these things we see in the future for how research will be done to become less costly and more efficient.
So that kind of brings us to our conclusion. But the final question that I have for you guys is, what one kind of takeaway would you say is the biggest thing you'd want people to take away from this report? Maybe the most important, maybe the most actionable kind of insight out of everything we've talked about today.
I would say, we need to think differently. I think long gone are the days that things will stay the same. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and not much changed until COVID hit, really. I mean, maybe we went from paper to EDC, and we had, paper TMF to electronic TMF, but it was all being done the same. It just was putting some technology to some manual processes. Now we're looking at the patient voice and how things will look in the future, and consolidated platforms of site networks, and how we use AI, and all of those things sort of coming together. What the future of research looks like will not stay the same. So, how we all come together to make sure we're meeting those requirements and looking at new ways of doing things is going to be very important moving forward.
And I would just add that it's really a time for resilience. When you look at fundamentally what the clinical research industry has learned over the last 10, 15 years, as well as the market opportunity, there are significantly underserved patient populations that need new therapies. There is extremely strong science. Many of it is being developed by very small companies, as well as mid-size and large, but the quality of the science is very strong, and the willingness to collaborate amongst all of these different providers, technologies, and tools that are available. It's a challenging time economically, yes, but the fundamentals are all there. And I think there's plenty of room for optimism and resilience as we go forward. And I think we should all be encouraged. Outsourced clinical research will continue, that we know. And I think the future remains bright.
Thank you both so much for joining me today. This has been super interesting. I always enjoy being able to kind of take a step back, look at the broader trends, not necessarily talk about one super zoomed in aspect of clinical research. So thank you both for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Of course, thank you to our sponsor, Advanced Clinical. As I said at the beginning of the show, if you liked what you heard, if you were intrigued, the whole report is going to be available, and we'll make sure that you can get there from the show notes on the App Store or on thepharmaforum.com. That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum. Thanks for listening.